merciful and reversible by God's peace and blessings be upon his Holy Prophet Muhammad and the purified members of his household and progeny. Respected sisters and brothers, assalamu alaikum. And for joining us once again for a series, Life in Islamic Answer, where we have been discussing for the past few sessions the Islamic community of knowledge with some of the important figures that are part of the community. One that we focused on recently is the figure of the intellectual. After we explained that this idea or figure or symbol of the intellectual emerged in the West as a result of a rebellion against a traditional worldview, the medieval ages that happened with the Enlightenment that led to modernity. We started to look at the emergence of the same role or a very similar role in the Islamic world as well. And we looked at what many of the thinkers who have looked into the role of the intellectual have had to say about who is the intellectual, what is the role in society, what should be the role in society, is it positive or negative, should they be involved and engaged and activist or not. And then we turned our attention to see what has been happening in the Islamic world. And we saw that in that case, the Islamic world did not mirror or match entirely what was happening in the West. And the reason is that what led to the emergence of that role in the West is not the same set of circumstances that led to its emergence in the Islamic world. And the main or major events that were taking place in the Islamic world basically took over the general psyche and understanding and attitude and culture and preoccupations of the Islamic world. Because in the Islamic world, it seemed like there was a free fall. There was a very clear decline in the Islamic world as a culture, as societies, as a civilization, especially when compared to what was happening in the West. The Islamic world felt like it was being completely subjugated, dominated, colonized, economically, militarily, intellectually, industrially, and so on and so forth. And so a lot of what was happening in the Islamic world was trying to deal with this reality of the decline, of the fall, of a civilization that was once considered to be the one that was leading the world in all of these dimensions. And so when the figure of the intellectual emerged as something to be thought about, the majority of the thinking came from that angle, from that point of view, that concern.
What is going to be the role of the intellectual for an Islamic revival, a civilizational, cultural, religious revival, reform? Something has to change so that we fix the situation we're in. And so we went through a series of thinkers to see what are the main themes that keep coming back, patterns of thought that keeps coming back, where some of the issues are being identified and some solutions are being proposed. And we said that we can group all of those who have thought about this idea of reform and revival and the role of the intellectual in the Islamic world in there into perhaps three categories. There's the category of those who say we are simply going to emulate and imitate what happened in the West, because if it worked in the West, then it's going to work for us. And so this is the only solution that we have at our disposal. So long as we do not do that, we are not going to be able to achieve the same results as they achieved in the West. And then we have the extreme point of view to that, which is we are going to entirely reject anything that has come from the West, including its enlightenment and modernity values and attitude and culture, and we are going to go back to our roots and our origins. And we're going to go back to the way the Holy Prophet lived and the first generations of Muslims lived. The solution is in that. Our prosperity and happiness in this world and the next lies in going back to live that type of lifestyle with those values, with those teachings, with those ideas. And then you have everything in between, which is we are going to try to preserve our identity and our culture and our origins while also finding a way to modernize and to live in a world that has changed drastically at a very, very rapid pace, and that continues to change. And so we have to think about what needs to change in our way of approaching the world and our understanding of religion so that we can adapt ourselves to the realities of the world and bring our civilization back and revive it and reform it. And we saw that the majority of the thinkers that we have gone through fall in this main category. This is where the majority of the thinking takes place. So this is where the majority of thought is. Because in truth, those who say we're just going to imitate the West, we cannot really consider them fully Islamic thinkers. Some of them are Muslims, but they have a very secularist understanding of religion and how religion is supposed to be very contained and limited and restricted to your individual relationship with your God and has nothing to do with the public sphere, exactly like in the West. And there are those who have even openly never addressed religion, as though religion is not a concern or perhaps a non-issue in this whole discussion. So we've put that aside. Our interest in this whole topic is from the Islamic point of view. And we said on the other side, we're also not too interested in those who say we're going to go back to living the way, the Holy Prophet and the Muslims lived 14 centuries ago, because we know that this is simply not realistic and not compatible with our Islamic teachings, in short, to save ourselves time. So what's left is our realities as Muslims, as minorities living in the West, trying to establish communities that are flourishing, that are in a way adapted to the realities of the greater societies in which they live, while at the same time maintaining our original identities and our original cultures and teachings and values and so on and so forth. So the last time that we met, we covered, I believe, 3 more thinkers, Alaya Izetbegovic, and we explained once again his success, his accomplishments, his role as a political activist who was able to take his religious thought and understanding of what Islam is, that it is the middle path between all extremes in the world, and to try to find a way towards allowing his society to live a normal, dignified, prosperous life in this world. In Europe, where they are a minority, where they went through a civil war, where they were the subject of a genocide, they were almost exterminated, and then finally they are able to achieve, some sort of independence, and he's able to rule that state for a few years before he retires and he passes away. And so there's a lot that can be said about these figures who were able to a certain degree at least, put in application some of the teachings and some of the writings that they published and they released and they shared with the world many, many years before, in his case, decades before. Since his youth, he wrote the manifesto and then the declaration, the Islamic declaration, and he wrote other works. And so there's always a lot more credibility to these types of thinkers because their ideas are not staying at the level of theory and mere hypothetical ideas. They are in a situation where they have to rule, they have to find a way to negotiate conflict and be present at the world stage, and he had to achieve a recognition from the European Union and from the United Nations to be a state and to continue to rule in that way. And so all of that deserves to be looked at a little bit more closely. And then we talked about 2 more figures that we said they go together, and they certainly deserve, not as figures, more as a topic or a contribution. It does deserve a much, much lengthier discussion than we're allowing it to take in terms of space and time right now, which is the idea of the Islamization of knowledge. And this is an idea that once again was in reaction to a feeling from two different thinkers who had a very different trajectory in life, but who ended up at a very similar point in their intellectual assessment of the Islamic world and their own situation, their own society, their own realities, in that the regime or the system of knowledge that exists in the world is not compatible with Islamic teachings. And this is why Muslims live in a situation of crisis. They have a knowledge crisis. They are unable to absorb the knowledge that comes to them and then deal with it in a way that is truly Islamic, because there is an incompatibility or a contradiction between the infrastructure, the foundations of the knowledge coming from the West, and true Islamic teachings and foundations. True Islamic teachings and foundations, as they were saying, they both emphasized, for instance, the notion of tawheed, the chain of being, the importance of morality, and so on and so forth. And so each one of them had a whole program in place, a whole idea that became institutions, that became a whole program of research and work, which continues until today. Al-Faruqi on one side and Naqib al-Attas on the other side. And both of them are, let's say, both projects are converging into the same outcome in general, even though in details there's a lot of differences between what they were proposing. In general, what they were talking about is to create an entirely new set of knowledge and to Islamize existing disciplines. And this does not mean that we take, a discipline that as it exists, psychology or sociology or economy, and inject a few verses of the Quran or Ahadith to it, and then we call it Islamic psychology or Islamic history. Right? There's a lot more work that has to happen so that the foundations of those disciplines become Islamic and they lead to Islamic outcomes or results. And we said that there is criticism around this project as well, by some within Islam as well, mostly. I haven't seen a lot of work from outside of Islam except for economy, where there are also a lot of attacks against all those who say there is an Islamic economy or Islamic finance, by those who are attacking Islam in general and saying that there is no such thing as an Islamic economy or Islamic finance. We haven't seen it. Where is it presented to us like a coherent system different from what exists in the world? There are these types of attacks. Whether they are founded or not, we leave it to another time. Okay? But other than that, non-Muslims in general have not been very interested in that whole movement. In the Islamic world itself, there are those who are very interested in it and pushing that forward still. And then there are those, some of the major thinkers too, who say this has wasted enough resources and enough time and enough thinking. This is not going to go anywhere. And if it was going to go anywhere, we would have seen the results by now, because it's been decades in the making and we still do not have any disciplines that we can call truly Islamic until now. Okay, so show us something that you have applied all of these theories and ideas to concretely, that we can call an Islamic discipline and that we can use to rethink other disciplines, for instance. That's one of the attacks, and we talked about a few of the others. We leave that for another time. This was just simply to say, there is that movement, there are these thinkers, and there are institutions behind them that exist until today that are still producing work in this regard. Okay, so we're not taking position one way or another to any of the things that we're presenting right now. And then we said, perhaps we spend at least one lecture talking a little bit about some of the Shia thinkers specifically with regards to this whole topic of the intellectual and the revival or reform of the Islamic world and the role of the intellectual in there and what it means and whether there is anything specific to the Shia thinkers or not. So here we can say a few things. The first is that we have already talked about a few thinkers who are recognized usually as Shia. Some of them openly and without any debate, they're well-known Shia thinkers, and some of them It's debatable, but generally speaking, it is understood that they were Shia. The first name, or one of the first names that we talked about after al-Tahtawi, was Jamal al-Din al-Afghani. Jamal al-Din al-Afghani is considered a Shia scholar, or a Shia figure at least. But it is clear that he went out of his way to strategically present himself as non-affiliated to any specific madhab. Whether we say this based on what could be simply a strategy to get things done and to be able to work with all of these different figures and personalities and movements and people in the Islamic world to keep the main project of reforming the Islamic world alive, or because he was not really that concerned with the idea of being affiliated to this madhab or that. But clearly from his background, the way he refers to Imam Ali often in the way he writes, some of his relationships with some of the scholars of the time, some of the Shia figures and scholars, some of whom there was correspondence and who considered him to be a Shi'i either during or after his life, all of that seems to point that he was a Shi'i figure and a Shi'i scholar, and I don't want to go back to what Jamal al-Din al-Afghani contributed and how he was considered to be basically one of the most pivotal, important figures of the Islamic reform movement that we spoke about. So not only was he extremely influential, but the people that he influenced also became extremely influential. People like Muhammad Abda and Rashid Rida, his student, and Sayyid Qutb, all of those people were directly influenced by the work and the ideas and the theories and the activities and the movement of Jamal al-Din al-Afghani. Okay, so that's one figure. The second figure that we talked about, so I'll mention him quickly again, I think it's relevant to talk about today, is Ali Shari'ati. So Ali Shari'ati is certainly a well-known Shi'i thinker, Iranian Shi'i thinker, and still considered extremely influential in his writings, in his thought. Until today, many people read him, are influenced by his work, react to his work, and so on and so forth. Just as a quick recap of what we said about Shari'ati and the time that he was active, he is someone who had a general strong academic background. He goes to the West to study, to finish his studies, and then he comes back. So already we know that he was very exposed to Western thought, and this is clear in the way that he writes and the way he presents his thought, very clear, and I'll talk about that in a second. He's considered to be a sociologist. He's a thinker, a philosopher in general, but as a specialist, he specialized in sociology. But a lot of his writing leans towards other areas, psychology, for instance, colonial studies, for instance, some literature. So a all-round good, strong intellectual who was also extremely active, and he believed in political engagement. As we talked about when we presented him as a figure, the importance for the intellectual to be very present in society, and he spoke at length about the role of the intellectual specifically. So in his case, he didn't just address the role of the intellectual in passing. He has at least one, full-length size book on the intellectual, and then he talks about the intellectual here and there in many of his other works as well. Some articles and conferences and lectures, and he lectured extensively, especially during Muharram, by the way, in some Husayniyat and others, as an intellectual. And a lot of these ideas came from there. And so he would focus, for instance, on the role of the intellectual being about social justice and fighting corruption and the importance of political activism. And so he would basically talk about the Islamic society in general, and specifically the Iranian society in which he lived, as being entirely colonized. And so a lot of his discourse is about how to escape and how to free ourselves from being colonized. And being colonized is not just at the level of the economy and the goods and the material world in which we live, but here, intellectually and mentally. And this is where he emphasized the role of the intellectual, that it is the role of the intellectual to educate the masses, to make them aware in the ways that they have been colonized, so that they can escape that. There's an awareness in society of what is leading to them being colonized. The importance of being engaged with modernity, the importance of living with the people, understanding their needs and working in that way and not being completely sheltered in isolation in the work that you do. So a lot of it had to do with education and awareness. Ali Shariati is also, even though he was influential, his work and his activity is directly related to the success of the revolution in Iran. This is all well established still, and nonetheless, he is still considered an extremely controversial figure by the clergy, by conservative scholars who have attacked him for different reasons. Some of the attacks are a little bit more shallow and perhaps lack the depth, simply because he seems to be taking inspiration from a lot of the Western thinkers, because he relies on the thinking of Marx and Fanon and Sartre and others, even though it may not be because he does not know how to go back to the Islamic sources and find those references. But he's talking to a different audience and a different group of people where he knows that this is going to be perhaps more influential. He was attacked for the reliance on these types of thinkers, even though he is presenting Islamic teachings. He was attacked for, or considered controversial, for his criticism of the role of the clergy, that he thinks it needs to be modernized, it needs to be rethought. He was very critical of what he calls, today we would call it a quietist scholar, so a scholar who does not believe in activism and engagement. And this is where he made a difference between red Islam and black Islam, for instance. Red Islam really referring to a communist version of Islam or an activist engaged version of Islam, right? And so this keeps bringing us back to kind of the same sources of influence on his thought and where it could bring people. So many considered him to be dangerous as a thinker. We're not sure where he's going with this type of thinking. And then he reinterpreted some of the most sacred figures in Islam in this way, that they are, even the notion of Tawheed was reinterpreted in this way. It's about freedom from the material grasp of anything that we live with, and the luxuries of life, for instance, especially when they come from the West and so on and so forth. Whereas maybe this would be a very reductionist way of understanding what Tawheed is. And so he seems to be working towards a very clear agenda, very activist, very politically driven, socially driven, about the realities of society and the people, the difficulties that they're living with, as opposed to kind of the deeper meanings behind, religious teachings and religious meanings of people like Abu Dhar and Sayyidah Zainab and Imam Hussein alayhi salam, where he constantly reinterprets those figures as meaning those things that he's pointing towards, and not the deeper, sacred, holy, universal meanings that they carry and they inspire to those who understand these figures. So in any case, but I would say perhaps one of the clearest direct attacks is also that it leads to the idea, and this continues until today, it leads to the idea that you can be religious. A lot of his lectures and the way he presents and the way he attacks some of the clergy, it gives the idea that you can be fully religious and truly religious without any clergy and without any reliance on scholars. So it's a religion, it's a faith without scholars. You do not need scholars. You reinterpret religion in the whatever way you need to make it work for you, based on some universal truths that apply to your reality and your social needs, and so on and so forth. So of course there was a direct attack on him because of all of that. I won't go much further in this. We talked about Ali Shariati. I just wanted to kind of bring him up and talk a little bit more about him specifically as a Shia thinker. The time that he was working and being very active, despite his role, he was still considered very controversial. There are a few other thinkers that I think are at least worth mentioning. So I'll mention them quickly, but I can't spend too much time on each one of them. And none of them really addressed the topic of the intellectual in this very direct way, as we saw, for instance, with Shariati. So I'll talk about some things that are clear from the activities of these thinkers to keep in mind, even though they never presented a full coherent theory about this is the role of the intellectual, this is how they're going to do their role, this is the good, the bad, the limitations, the interaction with religion, the interaction with the world. None of that was presented, but we can still understand, generally speaking, from their activities, from their writings, from their personal lives, what they believed in that space. So we'll talk about some of that very quickly. One of them is Shaheed Murtada Mutahhari and the work that he did. So for sure that Mutahhari is himself, we have to consider him an intellectual. He is an academic, and we have to come back to this point, inshallah. Inshallah, if all goes well in the next session, we'll try to create one session just for the conclusions, to draw all the conclusions from all of the sessions that we had about the intellectuals. But we are encountering again and again people who are falling in both categories of the intellectual and the religious scholar. So perhaps there is the idea that there is this huge exclusion or contradiction or tension between the figures is not very accurate. It's not always the case, or it's exaggerated. One can be both. And this is something we may have to come back to. So in any case, Murtada Mutahhari is considered this type of thinker, and the majority of his works and the majority of his activities in life were in fact more in the academic world. And he was closer to the academic world, and he was teaching there, and he was writing there, and he was interacting with university students and teaching at university, and so on and so forth. So while he has the full traditional Islamic learning and curriculum, he also has enough of the tools to use the scholarship from philosophy, from the rest of humanities, that is considered modern or Western, and to try to reinterpret and translate and present a version of Islam and Islamic teachings that that audience understands and that audience agrees with in a convincing way. And this is the work of Mutahhari. This is his big major project. You see that he talks about what is the human being from all the different aspects. Issues related to the belief system, issues related to the social system. All of these are presented, and they should be very, classic, traditional topics. But he presents them in a much more modern way. He engages with the thinkers of his time, the big philosophers of the West, some of them directly attacking, some of them not even talking about the same issues, but he'll draw from their notions, he'll react to them, he'll criticize them. All of this so that he modernizes the general discourse of Islam to bring it up to date in a modern way, so that this layer in society, the educated masses, the intellectuals of society, are engaged. And so they receive this type of education, and then they become influential in the right way in society. This is clear from the work of Mutahhari through his personal life, as well as the types of works that he left behind and how he addressed these notions of the reinterpretation and the presentation of Islam in a modern discourse that speaks to this layer of society. Another thinker that I think definitely worth talking about, Sayyid Muhammad Sadiq al-Sadr. So in his case, the cousin of Sayyid Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr, a marja in Iraq, in a very sensitive, very delicate, very difficult period, he led a grassroots revolution in Iraq. He tried to revive religion at a time when religion was entirely dead, at least socially, if not more. In society, you could not openly say, I am religious, especially not, I am Shi'i, not in Iraq. During that time, he emerges as a public figure, and he leads a public revival of this type of Shi'i thinking publicly. And so this also means that there is a strategy behind his work and how he is trying to bring in and carve out a space and a place and a role for the different factions of society, including the intellectuals, including people who want to engage in religion or who will accept to come into religion through that hook, through that intellectual hook. And so we see that in multiple ways. He talks about it in some of his Friday sermons, the khutab that he left, and many of them are recorded and available. He talks about the importance of recognizing the talents in the community and the talents in society and making sure that they are heard and that they are leveraged, Islamically recognized as people with a talent and something to contribute to religion. He's talking about those who are not coming from the religious background. They're not religious scholars. They're not religious specialists. He wants to bring them in. And so he's talking to the masses, but he's also talking to the hawza, the seminaries, to say this has to be a program and a way of thinking to make sure that these people are being used. And this is speaking to a major problem that we will come back to, inshallah, a little bit later today and the next time. Part of the big tension with the intellectual or between the intellectual and religion is specifically this, the lack of recognition that in fact goes both ways. So he addresses that directly, and then he addressed that in practice. So he would create things like competitions where people can write poetry. This is not typical, and he would say we are going to dedicate part of our huquq, right? The religious funds are going to be dedicated to giving prizes to people as they write pieces of verses of poetry about this topic or that topic to bring different layers of people into the fold. Okay, so that's part of it too. And then we have in some of his writings, the way he addressed a lot of the issues is not the typical way that scholars were addressing. Scholars like him, of his caliber, maraja', were not typically addressing all these types of issues in this way. He has a book, for instance, or a risala, a treaty, that we can call it on, for instance, حقوق الإنسان, the rights of, human rights, the Declaration of Human Rights. So there's a whole discussion on it. He doesn't talk about it and present it and address it as I am a religious authority addressing this. No, I will bring myself to that as a field, learn from it, and talk about it and criticize and discuss back and forth. This is me as a religious scholar going to outside of my domain to talk about another field and come back. Not bringing everything to my field and talking about it in my religious terminology and methodology and approach. He's not approaching it as I am a faqih and this is what fiqh has to say. This is haram and this is halal. It's not in that way. Okay? And he did that in multiple works. And even in some of his most famous works, the way he talks, for instance, in his encyclopedia about Imam al-Mahdi Ajjallah Farajah, his 4-volume encyclopedia, and the last volume of it, Al-Yawm al-Maw'ud, he talks about, what to expect and where is the world headed after, with the advent, with the arrival of the Imam, and afterwards, what to expect. The language that he uses and the presentation that he makes to the world, what he's presenting to the audience, the readers, is not the typical way a scholar presents things. There's an intent behind that. He's engaged in a discussion with different groups in society. There are works for the specialized portion in the hawza and those who have the specialized religious background, and there are works that are entirely for a different class of people. So this is to keep in mind, and we see that there was clearly a project and there was clearly a vision and a strategy behind this, and much more to talk about at another time. Another thinker that I wanted to mention that will open the door to yet another thinker, and maybe we'll finish with him today, is a thinker by the name of Abdul Karim Surush, an Iranian thinker, contemporary, still alive, still active, very influential today, who has, first of all, he is prolific. He writes a lot, he lectures a lot, he travels a lot, well-known figure on the academic side of Islam today, and who has addressed the role of the intellectual directly. In fact, today, I would say, especially in the Iranian world, but beyond, in the seminaries, for instance, a lot of the back and forth that you see, the internal discussion that you see in the articles and the conferences, a lot of it is addressing the issues that are raised by Abdul Karim Saroush. So if you go to the source and you understand these issues and the main responses to them, then right away you have a good mapping of what is going on in terms of discussions. When a book comes out, when a lecture addresses a topic, you know who they are talking about, what point they are addressing, what problem they're trying to solve, and so on and so forth. So I thought I would present him with a quick mention of his main arguments, or what he says about the role of the intellectual. What is his main concern? Because once you understand that, it becomes very practical for you to be able to understand a lot of the landscape, let's say. And then I'll come back, because this is going to give us the main issues that the scholars are contending with. And then we'll see if some have tried to resolve them and to what extent they were successful or not in resolving them. So Saroush is critical, generally speaking, of the relationship between the intellectuals and the clergy, the experts in religion. The intellectual, as in Arabic we would say the muthaqqaf, the one who has thaqafa, usually that's the intellectual, and the faqih, the jurist, the technical expert, the one whose main task is usually considered to be an interpretation of scripture, of inherited scripture. So either verses from the Holy Quran, either traditions, narrations from Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. This is the limit of the tools of the jurist. This is what the jurist is working with. And the intellectual is the one who is supposed to be relying on reason and rationality. His starting point, and so now I'm going to summarize some of his writings quickly, and then in what I say about it, I'm summarizing dozens of articles of back and forth between him and other thinkers, mainly scholars who have responded, and either he has responded to them or others have responded to them who have the same leaning and who have, who are in agreement with his ideas. So I'm just giving you a quick summary of the general landscape. The starting point is that they say, or Saroush will say, the starting point of the Hawza and the religious institutions and the university world, he says, is the same. The starting point is what is the role that they are supposed to perform in society. And that role, he says, is to educate those who are interested in being educated by these institutions. Except that one of these two institutions is working the way it's supposed to and has very positive effects on society, and the other one is not. And this is creating a situation of tension and conflict in society. So of course he's referring to the university being the one that works well, and the one that is very problematic is this very regressive, old school, literally old school, right? The hawzat, the seminaries. Why is it problematic? So he highlights a few things that we can put into three main ideas. The first one is that he says the university world does not have any what he calls red lines. Everything is open for complete critique, rethinking, discussion. You can put anything on the table. You can address it objectively without fear. This is the university world. This is where it's supposed to happen, these types of discussions, and it happens. Whereas in the religious institutions, there are topics that are taboo. They are behind red lines. They are not to be discussed. Those things are not to be put on the table for a real, true, in-depth discussion. And if you do that, there will be huge repercussions. So that's a first point. The second point, he says, is the relationship. Who is the main audience, or who do the intellectuals, the true intellectuals, the academics, who's their main audience, or who are they in relationship with? They are mainly in relationship with other specialists, with other academics, with other intellectuals. Whereas the people of the seminaries and the religious institutions, they are mainly in a relationship with the masses. And that means that this dilutes any specialized, in-depth knowledge and discourse. And the means that they have to present the information are also going to be non-scientific, anything goes, so long as you can convince the masses, you're good. This cannot work with specialists and with academics and with intellectuals. That's the second point. The third point is that he says, as we said, the role of both of these institutions is supposed to be about teaching people. You can't tell people how to live. You can't try to convince or not convince. Your role is just to present the information in the most effective way. You're not responsible for anything beyond. And this is what the university does. Objectively present the information and allow people to accept it as it is, and they don't go beyond that. Whereas religious institutions, they try to influence people. They try to perhaps even find ways to manipulate people into accepting, into changing their behavior, into believing, and. So this goes beyond their role. They're trespassing, they're overstepping the boundaries of their actual duties. And for these three main reasons, and there's a lot more that we can say, but for these three main reasons, we have to come to the conclusion that there's a real tension between these two groups of people. Let's not delude ourselves into thinking, because there's a whole movement or there's a whole attempt to bring these two together. Perhaps the intellectual and the academic has to come closer to the scholar and the jurist, and together they realize that they need each other to keep moving forward for the revival and reform of religion and society and civilization, that neither one of them can do it by themselves. And so this is the only way to keep things moving forward, and that there is no real exclusion and contradiction and tension between them. That's a whole movement. And in fact, we'll come back to that in the conclusion. He says this is all a delusion. We can't even aspire to move in that direction because there's a huge crisis happening here. These two are in full contradiction. You cannot bring them closer together. So part of the responses, I thought at least I give a very high-level quick overview of the discussions that happen. So regarding the red lines, the first point is that even beyond universities and institutions, and there is no place or field or area of activity for human beings that does not have red lines. It is very naive to think that there are areas of human activity that do not have red lines. Everything has red lines. Everything has taboos. Everything has people who are in power, in authority, who allow things to happen and do not allow things to happen. And if you do certain things, there will be consequences. And it is just naive, innocent, whether you realize it or not, it is just not accurate to say things that way. To pretend that there are environments where, for instance, there are no red lines. And specifically, the university world, there are red lines in the university world. You cannot put everything on the table. You cannot take any position. You cannot question everything. And if you do, you're going to pay a heavy price. You may pay with your career, you may pay with your reputation, you may pay with being ostracized, and anyone who works in a university context knows this. There are areas of research that if you have a certain leaning, the funding will come and the colleagues will appear and the partnerships will happen, and other ones you will be pushed aside and no one is interested, you will not get published, your work will not go through, your research will not be funded, and so on and so forth. Is it that different? It's a different set of rules, But to say that there are no red lines in the university world is simply not accurate. And anyone in the university world, especially where that type of research, which brings us to the next point, happens, would know this. And the next point is, in the university world is not this amazing place where people are going to learn how to have critical thought, as it is often portrayed, and as it is often portrayed in this argument. The majority, the masses who are going through the university world, they're going through it to get a piece of paper that allows them to become a productive piece in an economy, to get a job that allows the economy to keep functioning the way it's supposed to. This is very different from saying we are teaching people true critical thought. Very, very different. You see it in the reality. The masses who are at university are not even interested in critical thought. They're interested in passing their exams with the points that they need to pass an exam, and to get their credits and to get their piece of paper at the end. That's the majority. And even the way things are taught is not always to lead towards critical thought and everything is put on the table for discussion. This is not meant for that. Where this may be happening is once you reach the higher graduate studies, where you may have an ability to put some things on the table and discuss them and review them, and even that is done in a very strict, very clear way. That's another point. Another one, when it comes to the Hawza itself, it's also too easy to say there are red lines and that prevent everyone from working and doing anything. There are red lines. Yes, there are red lines. But as we saw, there are red lines elsewhere too. 1. 2, the history of the Hawzat is full of reformers who put things on the line, who reformed from the way to rethink, what should be taught? How should we be teaching it? What is the role of the scholar? What is the role of these institutions? Should they be active or not? Some of them are ostracized. They go elsewhere. They open another Hawza. There are students who come and that flourishes from the earliest times and until today. This is happening. So even if you want to say that there are red lines, they're not preventing those who, if we accept that there are red lines, they're not preventing those who want to do the work to do their work. They're still influencing, they still have their followers, they still have their works, and life goes on. So it's not to that point where what you're pretending or claiming or presenting as absolutely impossible work to do is not happening. Reform is constantly happening. That's one area of back and forth in the articles and in the conferences and in the discussions. Another area which has to do with the relationship with the specialists versus the masses. In that area, there's a couple of problems with this. The first one is that there's a claim, therefore, that the clergy, the scholars, deal with everyone as awam, as commoners, as though they are superior and others are inferior. There's something implied in that argument. And the truth is, this is actually the case. Awam is not a pejorative, negative word or term. It simply means that you are not a specialist in this field. So are you claiming to be a specialist in this field? If you are, there are ways to prove your credentials and that you are a specialist in this field. And this applies to every field. Just like you are a specialist in your field, where the religious specialist is a non-specialist, they are a ammi here. So the scholar becomes a commoner when he is talking to an engineer about engineering, or he's talking about a medical doctor about medicine. He's a commoner here. He's no longer a specialist. We're now talking about a specialist in religion, but this is an area of tension. And we'll come back to that perhaps in the conclusion, and we've already addressed it a few times already. The idea that both sides, but especially the intellectual, they feel like they are not recognized for their expertise and their, therefore, ability and right to have an opinion about religious matters. It comes down to this. I, as an intellectual, should have a right to have an opinion about religious matters. I am not just a commoner. I am an intellectual. I'm a thinker. So will the scholar allow that space, will engage in discussion, will take my thought seriously or not? That's really what is behind all of this. So we'll come back to that, inshallah, later. The point, though, he makes is the way they address the masses. So again here, unfortunately, it's fluffy and very general language, not accurate language. But they say that the clergy and the scholars of religion, they address people in a non-scientific way to basically manipulate their thinking. Instead of presenting the information to you, I will use poetry, and I will use myths and stories and emotions to get you to accept and to believe in what I'm trying to present to you. If I were to present it to you properly and scientifically and objectively, you probably wouldn't believe in it. So you are manipulated into that. And it's good for me that people remain at a lower level intellectually, because they will not be able to see that, to recognize that, and they will be more easily influenced or accept it more easily. That's part of the discussion too. And so what's implied here is that there's manipulation happening, intellectual manipulation happening. Again, this is a distortion of the way things are presented. This is not an accurate way. Are there people who do that? Maybe, sure, there might be. Does it mean that every single scholar is doing that and using that methodology to present information? Or is this what's happening to, for instance, educate and train scholars? Is this what's only contained in the books? And all of these people who are receiving all of this, none of them is waking up to the fact that maybe this is not accurate, maybe this is not convincing, maybe this is just a poem and I'm not going to take all my truth from that poem. It's not giving people enough credit. And on the other side, it's also very reductionist to claim that this is in general how all of this information is passed down to the people. This is unjust, oppressive to a lot of scholars who do not present their information that way. And the other side is, when it is presented that way, that's also part of the reality of the world, that you're supposed to adapt your messages to the audience, to the time and place where a message is being communicated. It doesn't necessarily mean that that message is wrong if I'm using another means to communicate it. There's a beautiful statement by Tusi. He says it's up to you when you are presenting kalam. It's up to you to present it in a way that the people will understand it, so long as the specialists will not object to what you said. You find any way to present the information you want. In fact, that's your job. If I'm teaching a group of 5-year-olds, I have to find a way to present the information to them, to that audience. And if I have 5 minutes to present something versus an hour, I have to find a way to do it in 5 minutes versus an hour. That's also part of adapting the message. There's nothing wrong with that. But if the specialists in my field say this is inaccurate, this is wrong, that's when we have a problem. So if you can show that there is information that is inaccurate that is being presented, we have an issue here. But that you're just objecting to the means being used, the how the information, that's not by itself an argument. We need a lot more. That the seminaries are supposed to be limited to educating the people and presenting the information in an objective way to society, just like universities are. Again, I will go back to saying, for those who have gone through the university world and just those who follow general culture, you should know that there are entire ideological battles happening for the type of attitudes and ideologies that are going to reign on a university campus. There's a whole movement that says most of the campuses are too left-leaning, for instance. Isn't that an ideological war? And isn't the issue there that therefore those campuses or those universities or those professors are going to be teaching people in a way that is leaning towards a certain ideology versus another? Isn't that the issue? So can we just cheaply and easily claim that universities present all the information without any ideological bias and everything is just pure objectivity? That's not accurate. So once again, there's an exaggeration on both sides. On one side, it's just rosy and perfect, and on the other side, it's all problems and issues and chaos and non-effective ways of teaching and so on and so forth. That's the first point. And the second point, and this one has been written a lot about, is that they say, the scholars say, we completely disagree with you on the first point you made, which you bring back here in this argument, which is when you said the university world and the religious seminaries are supposed to perform the same function in society, which is to teach those who are interested in learning. No, they say we disagree with that completely. Religious institutions are trying to perform the same role as prophets and messengers perform. Their job is to guide people. It's not to teach. Teaching is only a part of that. They're supposed to purify the lives of people. يُزَكِّيهِمْ وَيُعَلِّمُهُمْ or يُعَلِّمُهُمْ وَيُزَكِّيهِمْ. And this role is not limited to me just presenting information to you objectively. If this is the most effective way of guiding you, I will use that. If it is not, I'll use other mechanisms. I have a much bigger religious duty to perform that you're trying to limit to me being a teacher that is only going to present information to you. No, I'm trying to change your soul, the scholars say. I'm not trying to just present raw information. Don't limit my role to that. I'm not in this business of presenting information in an objective way. So that's a whole discussion. And even here, some have given the example, for instance, they say it's not a perfect match as an example, but just to give an example, you could say, for instance, the Department of Health in a state, in a country. The Department of State is supposed to provide health services to people. They're not supposed to do anything more. So if they do a campaign trying to force people to stop smoking, they're going beyond to influence people, and that would be wrong? No, because their role is not limited to this objective presentation of this is bad for you, but it's completely up to you. No, there's a huge cost to this, to society and to you. It's not good for you and it's not good for society that you continue smoking. So do we object that they're going beyond? So in any case, and here there's a whole discussion that, first point I could say very quickly, I could spend a lot more time on the idea or the general arguments that have been presented by many other, mainly Iranian thinkers, and there is a lot, really a lot to go through. But it becomes kind of like a rabbit hole, as they say, if we open that door. And I think with this, we have a pretty good idea, and then we go into more specialized arguments and a back and forth and so on and so forth. So one, I think this provides a gist of the argument. That's enough for what we're trying to achieve here. Secondly, there seems to be, if you go through enough of these thinkers and their works, there really seems to be a very different lens or perspective being applied to the discussion. Our concern is trying to understand Islam writ large and to apply it in a way that works for us. So we're going after thinkers who are talking about that. When you go to many of these very, very rich, very competent, very advanced scholars, thinkers of the Iranian tradition, many of them still alive today, they are reacting to their own political reality. And that's not so relevant for us. as interesting as it may be, even intellectually, to go back and forth and to see the arguments and understand the nuances. And if we limit the discussion to what is happening in one place at a specific time, it may no longer be relevant to us. And many of them are in that state, in that reality. A limited reality. There's a revolution that happened. Things are going in a certain way. They may or may not be in agreement with the way things are happening. There's a lot of reaction to that. We're not really concerned with any of that. That's not our reality here. Otherwise, the arguments themselves, they could be generalized, they could be modified, they could be presented, but we would have to go and do heavy lifting work to do that. So that's why I'm limiting the discussion to this. The second point is that the way Soroush and others like him present their arguments brings us back to what happened in the West. In the Islamic world, there does not necessarily need to be this conflict and tension between the intellectual and the religious figure. It doesn't need to be. It may be, but it doesn't need to be. So that we create two camps and then we have to label you. Which camp do you belong to? Are you an intellectual or are you a religious thinker? Are you closer to this or closer to that, so that I can put a label on you and know how to deal with you? And in the West, what happened after, as we said, the medieval times and with the Enlightenment and afterwards, it's the intellectual who became the official opposition to the traditional regime or worldview. The intellectual, became the person who represents the official opposition, opposed to this world we're living in, pushing towards all the other values that they are trying to put in place. So they are pushing for free speech and rationality and democracy and reason and humanism. And a lot in what we see in the writings, even though it is not said in that way, of Soroush and his likes, is in that vein. In that it continues to carry the same banner that I am the official opposition and I am the one who is going to emulate and mimic and imitate and follow in the footsteps of what happened in the West to lead to the same type of, but it's a much more sophisticated argumentation. But at the bottom line, it brings us back to the same point. So I'm going to be, or we as intellectuals, thinkers, we are going to be the ones who carry the banner of the official opposition to a traditional system and worldview. The issue, as we said, is it doesn't work as well, because that break never happened in the Islamic world as it happened in the West. And we talked about that in the past. There's a lot more that we can say here. I'm going to stop here for this and then talk about the last thinker that I wanted to talk about, and I'll try to go quickly here. The last thinker I wanted to address is Sayyid Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr. And the reason I kept him for last is that, once again, we do not have a thinker who presented a coherent, fully formulated theory about who the intellectual is and their role in society and what they're supposed to do and how they're supposed to be. We don't have that in Sayyid Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr. But we have plenty in his work that tells us what he was trying to do, and that presents us with his vision. And there is perhaps no one who did what he did with his works and with his vision so concretely to talk about. And so if we understand this, then we understand many of the other scholars and what they did, what they were trying to do, but perhaps they were not as influential, or they did not do it to the degree that he did it. And so the way I'm going to do this is to try to highlight it with really 3 points, but I'm going to add a 4th point to it. 3 points by going through his works, because I think it's good for us to know who he is and a little bit about his works. So that's an excuse to present that, as I always try to do. But at the same time, to see his vision and understand his general outlook on the role of the intellectual in society. So the first point, clearly from what he tries to do, in Arabic they say he was trying to perform تفقيه المثقف and تثقيف الفقيه. So he is trying to take the person who is an intellectual and inject into them specialized religious knowledge, and he's trying to take the person who is a religious scholar and inject into them intellectual knowledge, both at the same time. So where do we see that? Examples of that. Because if this is truly the case, it means that he is bridging a huge gap that others are saying is unbridgeable, and it's a delusion to bring these two together. And he's saying, no, there's a way to do this. And you can bring people together from these two different areas of life. And this is going to force something that is very different in society to happen. If this happens, it means that we are going to have one of two things. This is what we're keeping to the next time, inshallah, we meet. You are going to end up with someone who is an intellectual with specialized religious knowledge, in-depth religious knowledge, or you're going to end up with a religious scholar with advanced intellectual knowledge. And that's it. You've bridged the gap. So one or the other is dominant, that's fine, so long as there's enough of the other to function. The minimal threshold is elevated now. You can't just get by with one or the other if you want to be active. And his concern is, of course, mainly the jurist and the religious scholar, because to him, there's no way to be fully a religious scholar without having this intellectual knowledge. But on the side of the intellectual, he's saying we actually need you. We cannot perform our role, and his role at his time was to try to lead a social revolution, a political revolution. I cannot do this without you, the intellectuals. So I have to make you see the world from where we're seeing it. So what does he do? One work. Let's take the first work. There's a book that he wrote that is called المعالم الجديدة للأصول. So we have to understand what usul is first. Usul is a field, a science, a field of knowledge that does not exist in any other civilization. Sometimes they say in the Islamic civilization, the best that they were good at is to go and find what the Greeks and the Romans did and to translate it into Arabic. They're good translators. Some of the major thinkers and historians of the world say that Muslims did not contribute anything more to human civilization except to be a bridge that translated the Greeks and the Romans into Arabic and then to other languages. And so this allowed the Westerners to take that knowledge and do something with it. So they were a good bridge. And they don't talk about everything that this civilization actually created from scratch. That did not exist before. Usul al-fiqh is one such field. A field that was created specifically in the Islamic tradition, does not exist anywhere else. And the topics, the way they are put together and they are researched, does not exist anywhere else. And it has evolved tremendously. Initially, it started mostly in the Sunni school. The Shia school came later because the need for usul was not as present because we had access to the imams. And they didn't have an access to infallible source because they no longer had access to the Holy Prophet ﷺ. So they had a need for making their fiqh advance faster, to find ways to reach their solutions and their hukum. This came later. And both moved quickly and both evolved quickly, and it's an extremely rich field, and it continues to evolve until today. It's still dynamic and present and very alive. But still considered specialized field. It's very rare to hear anyone go to the pulpit and give a lecture and talk about anything related to usul al-fiqh, despite the thousands upon thousands of lectures about all topics, and very rarely will anyone talk about it unless you are in a class setting, learning Islamic law or the principles of Islamic law, which is what this field is. So this field tries to focus on the things related to Islamic law that are not specific to this or that chapter of Islamic law or question in Islamic law. So if something is specific to this question or this scenario or this chapter, Hajj for instance, this is what you study in fiqh. This is Islamic law. But if you have a question about Islamic law or that you would use to reach a conclusion Islamic law that is not specific to this or that question in fiqh, this is what you study in usul al-fiqh. It's like the logic of the fiqh. It's like the philosophy behind the fiqh. I don't want to say that because now there's a new emerging discipline that is being called falsafat al-fiqh, that is a little bit more specialized. But I think we understand what we mean. It's the common questions, rules, principles that are then applied to specific cases in fiqh. This is usul al-fiqh. I'm saying all of this why? To show how this is a very specialized field. That's why most scholars will not, if they have studied this field, and depending on how much they have studied this field, Sayyid Sadr is considered a genius in usul al-fiqh. To the extent that they have studied it, it would be very rare, in fact unheard of, to try to bring this to people who are not specialists. If you read the introduction of Al-Ma'alim Al-Jadida Lil-Usul, he says, I did not write this book for the specialists. I wrote this book to those who are curious and those who want to learn about fiqh, about Islamic law. And if you read it, you see that he gives you the history of it. How did we get here? Why is there a need for usul al-fiqh? Which you don't have, by the way, in the books of usul. Now you do. Now that people copy the approach and methodology of Sayyid Sadr, you do. But before him, that did not exist. That you have a book presenting to you usul al-fiqh, not written for the specialists, trying to explain to you why is this important, why is this relevant, so that you get into the mind, you get a glimpse into what is happening in the mind of this jurist when he says this is haram, this is halal. Is it because they feel like it? Because people have a lot of assumptions, a lot of ideas about perhaps why they're coming up with this. He's trying to open that black box to you. And he really wrote it to the university students. So this is where you see that he is putting in practice the idea that the intellectual has a role to play, and I will allow them to play that role. I will bring them closer to my world. This is a black box. Usually no one is privy to this type of knowledge. You have to sit in my class. You have to be here for years to study this so that you learn what it is. I'm going to make it all accessible to you. I'm going to change the language so that I'm going to use modern Arabic. If you can read Arabic newspapers, you can read this book. You will understand what I'm saying in it. And he says, this is not going to be all of my opinions. My opinions, I leave them for the more advanced works. This is so that I introduce this topic to you. Are you the educated masses, the intellectuals, those who are curious about this? This book is for you. So this is where you start to see that there's something different here. Why would a faqih go out of his way to write a book for the masses about a specialized field? That he thinks it's important enough to do that. By the way, the second version of the book that came out, it became Al-Halaqa Al-Ula. So Sayyid al-Sadr, he wanted to rethink and reform how usul is taught, because he said the current curriculum does not work at all. And so I'm going to create a new curriculum for usul, and we're going to do it in 3 layers. So I'm going to teach you all of usul in very condensed form, and we're going to call it Al-Halaqa Al-Ula, the first circle. And I'm going to teach it again to you, but now we're going to go in a little bit more depth. And this is going to be Al-Halaqa Al-Thaniya, the second circle. And then I'm going to teach you everything else you need to know in depth to start preparing you to go to Bahath Kharij. I'll give it all to you after. Third circle, Halaqa Al-Thalitha. So that book, Al-Ma'alim Al-Jadida Lil-Usul, the new landmarks of usul, as he calls it, it became in a modified form. When it appeared a few years later, it became Al-Halaqa Al-Ula. But he removed all of the history. Now it became a book for the specialists who are now about to enter to become jurists. It's no longer written in the same way. The content is very similar, but there are things that were removed, the language changed. Now I have to teach you the terminology you're going to need so that when you attend the lessons of the specialists, you know what they're saying. I'm going to bring it all back to the normal terminology that we use. Okay, this is just one example. That there is a vision behind this type of work. That he wants to bring the intellectuals closer. You're interested? I'm going to give you the tool. You sit and read the book alone. Unheard of. I can say the same thing, by the way, about his Risala Amaliyah. Huge objections when he released Risala Amaliyah in his time. Huge objections because he wrote it in a way where people can just read it and understand. Or at least that was the intent. I think it was still too technical as a language. Whereas the normal Risala, it is written intentionally so that you do not read it alone. So that you rely on a scholar to interpret the hukum. Because if you read it as it is written, there are technical terms that if you have not studied, you do not know what they mean. You will think they mean something. When it says yu'tabaru, when you read fiqh and it says yu'tabaru, you're going to think it has to be taken into consideration. Yu'tabaru means yushtaratu, means it's a condition that you do this. But if you haven't studied fiqh under a teacher who teaches you this, you will completely miss it because you think you understand Arabic. But this is not Arabic you're reading. You're reading technical terms. But he didn't write his risala that way, so that people can read it. There's a vision behind that. Anyways, the second point. The second point is he is trying to re-establish the foundations of knowledge on a modern basis. What does that mean? He says that the knowledge that we have today is based on a foundation that is very, very old. It comes to us from old school, medieval times, and even before. Scholastic knowledge. The way they used to do logic at that time. That's why they still study the logic of Aristotle until today. So he says, we're going to rethink the foundations of all knowledge. Just for the sake of, because we have a lot of free time? No. We're going to re-establish all of this knowledge, and we're going to do it in a way so that it is the same foundation used for modern knowledge, for the natural sciences, for empirical knowledge, for modern knowledge. What do they use? What should they be using as a foundation for all of their knowledge? To know something. What is the logic? What do we have to all agree on before we both say, I know this? So he says the foundations that we're currently using are outdated. In fact, there are huge issues. If you dig into them, you're going to see that there is a huge problem that we have, and we're all pretending it's not there. Because the problem is very specialized. But since David Hume is a philosopher who attacked a notion in philosophy and logic called induction. Induction is by opposition to deduction. Deduction means that when you have a conclusion, the conclusion is not outside of what you know. You can deduce from it or deduct from it. Induction means that you're going beyond what is known. You're generalizing. Are you allowed to do that or not? So he demolished the idea that you're allowed to do that, and therefore nothing stands, and that's why we have to live in constant doubt, and we cannot know anything in life. That's David Hume's big contribution, summarized in 1 minute. And then Kant came and tried to resolve that, and until we come to present day. But that problem remained the case. This is a problem in logic and philosophy and epistemology and the theory of knowledge. So this becomes Sayyid Sadr's starting point. He says, I'm going to resolve this problem. If this problem remains there, it has already existed for a long time, but no one pointed to it and showed where this is a very big problem, and if it is not resolved, then we have a very big issue. And their attacks against our belief in God are actually valid. So we need to fix this problem. And so he wrote a book to fix this problem specifically, to create a new system of logic. The logic that people have been using for, I'm going to say, 1800 years was the logic of Aristotle. Since then, in the Islamic world, they've continued to use the logic of Aristotle, but in the West, they started to use Frege and the modern symbolic logic and more math into it and so on and so forth. In the last, 150 to 200 years. You study that in logic and the philosophy of logic. Sayyid Sadr created a new logic, as if, that's something you just do. He created a new system of logic to become the foundation of all knowledge. And then he says, now, let's see if this foundation can work for natural science. It does work. Beautiful. Let's see if it works for the foundations of religious knowledge and belief in God. It works. Beautiful. Now both of you can talk together. We've established the same foundation for all knowledge. The same logic. We're no longer having a problem with induction. We've shown that induction is a perfectly valid logical form to be used to achieve results that human beings accept. Pure rationality is problematic and empiricism is problematic. They both need induction for them to work. But it's implied. But if you show the process, you'll see that there's induction there for any knowledge to occur. That's what he did in Usus al-Mantiqiyya lil-Istiqra', the logical foundations of induction. This is work that completely takes out the fiqh from the work of fiqh. This is going in the world of the intellectual and telling the intellectual, you and I are now going to work using the same foundations. We're going to speak the same language. Our starting point is the same, and then we're going to build on that. The third point, presenting the Islamic teachings in the most serious and in the most deep, objective manner that is compatible with modern times. It's not enough to just say, trust me, Islam has a really good economic theory. I'm going to present it to you in detail. I'm going to show you that what we believe in as a belief system, as a way of life, this is not just based on how I feel today and a general inclination towards belief versus not belief, as is often portrayed. Until today, in the West, for instance. Are you more a person who needs to know or not? That's the reason why you may become religious or not. He's trying to say, no. Actually, our entire belief system is entirely based on very strong logic, very valid logic. There are no weaknesses in our thinking. And that this way of life that it produces is perfectly valid. In fact, it is more coherent and consistent than any other way of life. And the two big alternatives, as it is claimed in the world, is the materialist version of dialectical materialism of Marxism and communism, or the secularist, democratic materialism of the West. So he wrote Falsafatuna, or philosophy, to say, no, there's actually a third very valid one, and those two are not valid. They're not valid ways of life or ways. They're contradictory and inconsistent and do not meet the human needs, and so on and so forth. But there's another third way of living and believing. So I'm going to put it on the map. And I'm going to show how the other two are inconsistent and contradictory and failures. And when he wrote that, he said, and the next part of the project is I'm going to show you how to build a society based on these beliefs. But then the pressure came on the Sayyid to, instead of going in detail about how to put a society together, they told him, no. The emergency right now, the pressing need is to talk about the economic system specifically, and then you can go back to talking about society. Because he had announced that after falsafatuna, our philosophy, it would be mujtama'una, our society. He said, but because of the pressure that came, I listened to them, and I produced this one that was supposed to be coming later, which is our economy. By the way, he wrote all of this in his early 20s. All of this was done in the early 20s. He left this world in his late 40s. All of this influence and all of this effect that he left in the world, the legacy that he left in the world, this was before 50. This gives us an idea of when they say he's a prodigy, what they mean by prodigy. What he was writing in his, when he was 18 and 16 and 19. So he wrote his book, Our Economy, again to show that the claim in the world is that there are two main economic systems. So he already established that the foundation of it in the first book is inconsistent, contradictory, weak. Now he's like, I'm going to show you in application. If I want to apply it to the economic system being the main one today, where the majority of the discussion is happening, where all of society rests, let's look at the economic system. So let's look at liberal capitalism and let's look at the Marxist version of socialism and communism. And see, is there a third way that makes a lot more sense than these two systems or not? And that's what he tried to do in اقتصادنا, our economy. So here, again, the discussion is not your typical jurist discussion. He is engaging with a completely different class of people. And what he's trying to do in society is very different. Which brings us back to what I called تثقيف الفقيه and تفقيه المثقف. This is him putting it in application. His idea, so now we have to come to the fourth point, which I said it's just between brackets quickly. His idea can be seen in the way he also believed in the activism or engagement of the faqih in the political sphere. And this is where we see perhaps the conclusion from all of this. Why does he need these intellectuals? His main theory, I don't want to go into the details of the political theory of Sayyid al-Sadr. There would be too much to say, and he seems to have changed his mind. It evolved with time. But his general idea is that the faqih has to be involved, but the faqih remains involved for an overall oversight, but does not rule and does not administer in the state. Who administers the state? Those who are competent, those who are specialists, the intellectuals. And he wants them to have this type of education and this type of awareness, this type of background, so that when they are in these positions, they are leading towards something that is entirely compatible with Islam. It's not the jurist himself who enters into the political arena. They provide a general oversight, they provide general guidance, but they do not intervene directly, they do not administer directly. You need specialists for that. So is there a role? 100% there is a role. But we have to educate them and give them the tools and prepare them so that when they take that role, they are ready. I think I'm going to stop here. Inshallah, the next time that we meet, we'll try to draw the conclusions from these few lectures that we had, a dozen lectures or so on the role of the intellectual, and then to try to apply some of this to our communities. What does it mean for us to carve out a space in our communities for the intellectual? Who is the intellectual? And what is the role in our community, or specifically in our community of knowledge? وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. So we have about 10 minutes. وأنتم. So questions, concerns, تفضل. it is not known. There are some who have said that the book was written but never published, the book was written but confiscated, but generally speaking, the book is not known to exist today. Yeah. There are some who have tried to write a book based on the foundations of Sayyid al-Sadr, called Mujtama'una, based on the foundations of the Sayyid. Yes, all these books, yes. So Usus al-Mantiqiyya, so the logical induction, the logical foundations of induction. The translation of it is very weak, the one that is popular. I know of a translation that was supposed to be very professional and very competent, and I was never able to see it. And I tried. It was impossible to get a copy of the book, but there is apparently a copy, a translation that has been very professionally done that exists for the logical foundations of induction, if you are interested. And the book reads well. You might think that it's, very difficult to understand. I read it a very long time ago, and it was very understandable. And the Iqtisaduna is perhaps the heaviest one to read. Ideally, these two books, at least, if not all three books, should be taught. They shouldn't be just read. They should be read in group or taught. But all three of them are meant to be read. They are for the educated masses, let's say it that way. Falsafatuna is translated. Iqtisaduna, I don't know how to assess the translation. Yes, and I don't know the detail of that. Ahsantum. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The objection is that it disconnects the people from the scholar. We want the people to be connected to the scholar because this ensures that they're always receiving their religion from a human being who knows how to answer, as opposed to I give you a book and then off you go. And who knows how you're going to interpret and what you're going to do with that. That's the objection. Yeah. It's two different, I'm trying not to take a position, right? I'm just saying things as they are. Here I'm talking about there is a clear vision in his case and in his students who followed him, who learned that from him, and other scholars too. It's just I mention him because he was extremely influential in that area, that he thinks that there are people who already are the intellectuals who are craving and who have a need for more religious knowledge and who have the intellectual capacity to get it if we provide it to them properly. One. And two, if they don't exist, we have to create them. And he wanted to create a generation of people who are like that on both sides. He wanted to create that generation in the Hawza. He wanted the people who are coming and who are students of the Hawza, the scholars of the Hawza, and that's why they say Tadqif al-Faqih. He wanted them to have a different thinking and different way of, viewing the role as a faqih. And he wanted to have the masses who are not the fuqaha. They are intellectuals, but they have this solid background in Islamic teachings. And then between those two, you are able to, move mountains and create miracles in society, if you have enough of them. So that people stop. Yeah. And it's well known. It's not just in the West, they would tell Nietzsche, for instance, that his books are incomprehensible for most people, and he would say that I'm not writing to those who do not understand. Like, it's intentionally written that way so that we filter out those who are not worthy of reading what I'm writing. Right? It's not written for the masses. I'm only talking to a select group in society. Yeah. Okay. So inshallah we continue next time. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa alihi at-tahirin. Muhammad wa